Hi everyone, Pastor Tabitha here. I came to you to talk to you about this coming week's devotions. Last week we talked about Moses and the burning bush and how Moses didn't feel equipped, and so he found excuses to go, and God ended up saying, like, I'm sending you and I will empower you to go. This week is Moses and his going. We're covering Exodus chapter 4 or chapter 4 through chapters 13. Um, so the summary of this is that Moses and Aaron, they go to Pharaoh and they say, Pharaoh, let the Israelites go. And Pharaoh says, prove to me that your God is really sending you. So Aaron turns his staff into a snake, and then the magicians come in and they turn their staffs into snakes, and Aaron's snake eats up their snakes, and then he picks it back up and it turns back into a staff. And this demonstrated to Pharaoh God's power, and Pharaoh was still unwilling to let the Israelites go, even after Moses was like, please let the Israelites go. So Pharaoh said no and sent Moses and Aaron on their way. Moses and Aaron, they come back and they say, hey, please let our people go. God is telling you to let our people go. And Pharaoh's heart was hardened. And he said no again. So the water then in Egypt was turned to blood, thus killing off their water supply, killing off their food supply of fish, and Pharaoh's heart was hardened again. The next day, Moses comes back with Aaron, and they say, hey, please let our people go. And from there, the frogs come out, and Pharaoh says, no, I'm not going to let your people go. So the frogs come out, and Moses and Aaron, they come back the next day and they say, please let my people go. God is asking you to let my people go. And Pharaoh said no. So then came the gnats. And then Pharaoh said no. And then came the flies. And Pharaoh said no. And came the boils. And Pharaoh said no. And came the locust. And Pharaoh kept saying no. And God kept on sending things. And then at the end of the ninth one, what we see Pharaoh begging, hey, please make this stop. I'll worship your God. And so after the 3 days of darkness stops and the Egyptians can see again, Pharaoh still says no. In fact, after each plague, Pharaoh's heart was hardened because he was choosing not to listen to God, and he was choosing to separate himself out from God. And so then comes the next part. And in the next part, Aaron and Moses, they come back and they know it's going to be bad this time. And they're like, please let our people go. Please do this. And Pharaoh said no. And so Aaron and Moses sent out to the Egyptian leaders, or the Israelite leaders, hey, you need to take a lamb and you need to put the blood on the doorpost of your house. And your neighbors, if they don't have a lamb, you need to give them your lamb so that they can cover their doorpost with the lamb's blood too. And through this, all of those with blood on their doorposts were saved, or would be saved. And that night, the Spirit swept through and took the firstborn of all the Egyptians, including the Pharaoh's son. At this, the Pharaoh was heartbroken, and rightfully so. And he looked at Moses and he looked at Aaron. He said, get your people out of here. And so Moses and Aaron, they spread the word that they were leaving, and all of the numerous Israelites that were living in Egypt, not only did they leave, but they left with all of their flocks, and they left with a bunch of other stuff that the Egyptians gave them, and they were able to leave their bondage. Today's story it's a hard one. It's one that I wrestle with quite often, actually. And I keep coming back to, well, what is the goodness of this story? Because it seems like a whole lot of bad. And the phrase we keep hearing over and over again was that Pharaoh's heart was hardened. Um, so I want you to stop and I want you to think about this. If you were to go onto a wall and barely lean on it, how much effort does that cost you? It doesn't cost much effort at all, but the wall doesn't move. The wall is still in place. And it doesn't matter how hard you press on the wall isn't going to move. The harder you press, though, the harder your body aches, and the harder your body becomes, not the harder, but the weaker your body becomes. The more force you exert into moving an immovable object, the more exhausted you are. Think of it like this in the imagery. Pharaoh, the wall was letting people go. And Pharaoh was pressing against it and pressing against it. And he kept pressing harder and harder and harder and working the slaves harder and harder and harder. But the wall wasn't going anywhere. See, Moses was given the opportunity, or Pharaoh was given the opportunity to free the Israelites. But he pressed the wall harder and he refused. And the harder he pressed, the harder it became for him. But then, sorry, somebody's coming in. I got distracted. Well, I guess what we can take from this is that God is always telling us something to do. God has a call for each of us. Sometimes it's hard and sometimes it's easy. But God is pressing us to do something. And we have the choice to have a hard heart like Pharaoh, where God is saying, I need you to do this. And God, I don't want to. God, no, because this is too hard. God, no, because I want my power. I want my freedom. I want what I want, and I want to be in charge of my own life. And so our hearts become hardened because God is pressing us to do something, and we just don't want to. We want our own way. But the flip side of that is Moses. And Moses didn't have a hard heart. Moses' heart was softened towards God. He knew the journey was not going to be easy. He was a man with a stutter. He was a man who had to face the reality of his past in order to free a whole group of people. He was a man with a stutter and a man that most of society would be like, dude, who is this guy? But that being said, he still went. He still went to Pharaoh over and over again. Please let these people go. And had to hear rejection. He had to hear no, and he had to watch a place that he once loved get punished because somebody was saying no. But Moses' heart was still softened towards God as he still trusted God even in the midst of all of this. Moses' heart was soft. We can have a soft heart. We can have this reality where God asks us to do something hard, and we can choose to say yes, even if it sucks. So we get to choose. We get to choose if it's going to be a hard time, and we get to choose to harden our hearts towards God. We get to choose whether we're going to do what God asks us to do, but the consequences of that choice is that life is just going to get harder for us. Or we can choose to have a softened heart towards God, a heart that says yes, that faces rejection, that faces watching things go wrong as we say yes, knowing and trusting God all along the way. And when we do that, the consequences of that, just like Moses had, this is a good consequence, but the consequences of that is that It's freedom. When we're trusting God all along the way, even if it's hard, it's freeing to know that we are not being held captive by the hardness of our own heart, by our selfishness. But it's not just freedom for that. It's freedom to see and to know what God is doing, to see God at work in the world around us, and to lead a group of people to freedom also. We carry the promise of being the leader of a great nation because we carry the promise of being able to tell the world what God is up to and walk with them as they journey to God too. And as we get to walk with them in their freedom also. This is a tough lesson for me this week because I've been dealing with some stuff and I've wanted the hard heart, but God does funny things with good timing, and I'm hearing this lesson today. The verse for the week to go, or the memory verse for the week, or the verse to write down and to pin up on your board, whatever it is that you want to do, is Psalm 119, verse 36. It's, turn my heart to your words and not to my selfishness. I hope you all have a softened heart this week as we go out and we listen to what God is calling us to do.